$3,800,000,000. That's what the world believed Ethan Carter was worth. From the outside, his life looked like something pulled straight from a magazine cover. He owned a penthouse overlooking Manhattan. He traveled in private helicopters. His companies employed thousands of people across the country. Every room he entered seemed to stop for him. Every hand reached out to shake his. Every conversation changed the moment he arrived. To most people, Ethan Carter had won the game of life. But on a cold October morning, something happened that nobody saw coming. Less than 24 hours after attending a high-profile charity gala surrounded by celebrities, executives, and politicians, Ethan Carter was lying on a wooden park bench wearing a torn jacket stained with dirt. The expensive suits were gone. The luxury watches were gone. The bodyguards were gone. The billionaire who could buy almost anything he wanted now looked like a man struggling to survive another day. Passers-by barely looked at him. Some crossed the street to avoid him. Others glanced at him for a moment before continuing on with their busy lives. Nobody recognized him. Nobody stopped to ask his name. What makes this story remarkable isn't that a billionaire decided to disguise himself as a homeless man. What makes it remarkable is why he did it. Because just months earlier, Ethan had found himself standing alone in a mansion that felt emptier than ever before. He had spent years building an empire, yet the one thing he couldn't seem to find was certainty. Were people drawn to him because of who he was or because of what he had? Every relationship seemed to leave him with more questions than answers. Every compliment felt rehearsed. Every promise sounded convincing until it wasn't. Then one night, after a conversation that would change the course of his life, Ethan came up with an idea that many considered ridiculous. Some called it reckless. Others called it desperate. Ethan called it the only way he could finally learn the truth. For the next 30 days, he would hide his identity completely. He would abandon the image that had defined him for decades and enter the dating world as someone nobody would ever envy. No luxury cars, no designer clothes, no mention of his wealth. No clues about the empire he secretly controlled. Over the next month, he would meet 10 women through a series of blind dates arranged under carefully crafted circumstances. Each woman would believe she was meeting an ordinary man who had fallen on hard times. None of them would know they were sitting across from one of the wealthiest men in America. None of them would know that every conversation, every reaction, every choice they made would reveal something far more valuable than money. At first, the experiment seemed straightforward, but as the days passed, Ethan found himself confronting truths he never expected. Some encounters left him disappointed. Others left him questioning everything he thought he knew about people. And then came the 10th date, the one meeting that would alter his future in a way he never imagined possible. The woman he met that day would force him to confront a reality he had spent years avoiding. A reality that had nothing to do with wealth, success, or status. What happened during that final blind date would leave his closest friends speechless, divide opinions among those who knew him best, and ultimately change the direction of his life forever. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. To understand why Ethan Carter was willing to risk his reputation, disguise himself as a homeless man, and spend an entire month testing strangers, you have to understand the man he was before the experiment ever began. By the age of 58, Ethan had achieved what most people spend their entire lives chasing. Starting with a single delivery truck in his early 20s, he built one of the largest logistics companies in the United States. His business moved products across cities, states, and eventually continents. Over the decades, his company grew into a giant operation worth billions of dollars. Business magazines praised his determination. Financial networks celebrated his success. Young entrepreneurs studied his story, hoping to follow in his footsteps. Yet behind every headline was a reality very few people knew. Ethan's personal life looked nothing like his professional success. He had been married twice. Both marriages ended in painful divorces. The first collapsed under the pressure of endless work hours and years spent putting business before family. The second ended under circumstances Ethan rarely discussed publicly. Those closest to him noticed a change after that marriage fell apart. The confident businessman who could negotiate million-dollar deals without hesitation became increasingly cautious whenever relationships were involved. Trust became something he gave reluctantly. Every new friendship came with questions. Every new romantic relationship came with doubts he could never fully silence. The strange thing about wealth is that it attracts people from every direction. Some arrive with genuine intentions. Others arrive carrying hidden agendas. Over time, Ethan found it harder and harder to tell the difference. Invitations never stopped coming. His phone was constantly ringing. People laughed at his jokes, agreed with his opinions, and praised his accomplishments. But deep down, he often wondered how many of those relationships would survive if his fortune disappeared tomorrow morning. How many people actually cared about Ethan Carter the man, rather than Ethan Carter the billionaire? Those questions followed him everywhere. They followed him into business meetings. They followed him onto private jets. They followed him back to the penthouse overlooking the city. Some nights, after entire days spent surrounded by people, he found himself sitting alone staring out the window wondering whether genuine connection was something money had accidentally taken away from him. Had his success created a barrier that nobody could see? Had becoming wealthy made it impossible to know who truly cared? And if someone believed he had absolutely nothing, would they still treat him with kindness, respect, and dignity? The more Ethan thought about those questions, the more they consumed him. Eventually, curiosity turned into determination. He wasn't looking for another relationship. He wasn't trying to prove a point to the world. He wanted answers for himself. Answers he believed could only be found through experience rather than assumptions. That decision would lead him toward one of the most unusual experiments of his life. An experiment that would introduce him to 10 women, 10 very different conversations, and 10 opportunities to discover something about human nature. But there was one woman among those 10 who would stand apart from all the others. A woman whose actions would challenge everything Ethan believed. A woman who would eventually discover the secret he worked so hard to hide. And when she learned the truth, her reaction was the last thing anyone expected. Instead of bringing them closer together, it created a moment that threatened to end everything before it had even begun. The question wasn't whether Ethan would find someone who could see beyond money. The question was whether he would be willing to face what happened when someone finally did. The roots of Ethan Carter's experiment stretched back 3 years before he ever sat on that park bench. At the time, he believed he had finally found what had been missing from his life for so long. After years of failed relationships and emotional distance, he met a woman named Vanessa. She was intelligent, charming, confident, and nearly 20 years younger than him. Friends warned him to be careful, but Ethan dismissed their concerns. For the first time in years, he felt hopeful. Vanessa seemed different from the people who usually entered his world. She rarely talked about business. She appeared uninterested in expensive gifts. She listened when he spoke about his childhood, his struggles, and the sacrifices he had made while building his company. Slowly, Ethan lowered the walls he had spent years constructing around himself. Their relationship moved quickly. Within a year, wedding plans were underway. Luxury venues were being reserved. Guest lists were drafted. Designers were hired. Family members who had not seen Ethan genuinely happy in years began to believe he had finally found peace. Looking back, Ethan would later admit there were warning signs. Small details that didn't seem important at the time. Questions about financial arrangements. Unexpected purchases appearing on shared accounts. Excuses that never quite added up. Yet whenever doubt appeared, Vanessa always had an explanation ready. And because Ethan wanted to believe in the future they were building together, he accepted those explanations. The truth began revealing itself through a series of discoveries that, on their own, seemed insignificant. An unusual bank transfer, a credit card statement that didn't match what Vanessa had told him, luxury purchases shipped to locations she claimed she had never visited, At first, Ethan convinced himself there had to be a misunderstanding, but the more questions he asked, the more inconsistencies he found. Concern slowly turned into suspicion. Suspicion turned into investigation. What he uncovered would shake him in ways he never anticipated. Financial records showed thousands of dollars being spent without explanation. Accounts he didn't know existed suddenly appeared. Then came messages he was never supposed to see, conversations with other men, private meetings hidden behind fabricated stories, promises being made to multiple people at the same time. The woman Ethan planned to marry had been living a life he knew nothing about. Every discovery felt like another piece of a painful puzzle falling into place. The future he had imagined began collapsing around him, one revelation at a time. Yet the affairs and secret spending weren't what affected him most. As devastating as those discoveries were, another realization cut even deeper. During conversations recovered from messages and emails, Ethan found references to his wealth that left him stunned. Discussions about his properties, estimates of what she might receive through marriage, calculations about future financial security. For the first time, he was forced to confront a possibility he had spent years trying to ignore. What if the relationship itself had never been the goal? What if everything he believed was genuine affection had simply been part of a larger plan? The engagement ended quietly. There were no dramatic public statements, no press conferences, no interviews. Ethan canceled the wedding, paid the necessary penalties, and withdrew from public life for several weeks. People speculated. Rumors spread. Most never learned what truly happened. Those closest to him assumed time would eventually heal the damage. They believed the failed relationship would become another painful chapter that faded into memory. But they were wrong. Because the betrayal itself wasn't what ultimately broke Ethan Carter. The secret spending hurt. The lies hurt. The affairs hurt. But what happened after the relationship ended left a wound far deeper than anything Vanessa had done. In the months that followed, Ethan would discover something that made him question nearly every relationship in his life. And once he saw it, he could never unsee it. In the months following the collapse of his engagement, Ethan Carter began noticing things he had previously ignored. The pattern appeared everywhere. Invitations that suddenly stopped arriving after he declined a business opportunity. Friendships that seemed to depend entirely on what he could provide. Conversations that always seemed to circle back to money, influence, or access. The more he paid attention, the more isolated he felt. It was as though years of success had surrounded him with people while somehow leaving him completely alone. Every smile became a question mark. Every compliment felt uncertain. Every relationship carried a shadow of doubt. Ethan had spent decades learning how to evaluate business risks, but he no longer knew how to evaluate the intentions of the people around him. One evening, while sitting alone in his penthouse overlooking the Manhattan skyline, he found himself staring at the city below for hours. Thousands of lights stretched across the horizon. Millions of people were living their lives beneath him. Some were struggling. Some were thriving. Most would never know his name. And for the first time in years, Ethan wondered what would happen if he became one of those anonymous faces. What if nobody recognized him? What if nobody knew about the billions of dollars, the private helicopters, the luxury properties, or the business empire? What would remain after all of that disappeared? The idea sounded absurd at first. Even Ethan laughed when it entered his mind. But unlike most passing thoughts, this one refused to leave. Day after day, it returned. The more he thought about it, the more convinced he became that it might be the only way to answer the questions that had haunted him since Vanessa left. He couldn't rely on introductions through mutual friends. He couldn't trust dating profiles that immediately revealed his status. He couldn't continue wondering forever whether people cared about him or his wealth. He needed proof. Eventually, Ethan shared the idea with the only person he trusted completely, his longtime executive assistant, Michael Reynolds. Michael had worked beside Ethan for nearly 15 years. He knew the businessman better than almost anyone else. He had witnessed the rise of the company, the failed marriages, the heartbreak following the broken engagement, and the emotional distance that followed. If anyone could talk Ethan out of a reckless decision, it was Michael. When Ethan explained his plan, Michael thought he had lost his mind. At first, Michael assumed it was a joke. Then he realized Ethan was serious. The billionaire wanted to spend 30 days pretending to be homeless while going on blind dates arranged through carefully selected channels. No luxury transportation, no designer clothing, no expensive watches, no security teams, no clues about who he really was. Michael listened in disbelief as Ethan laid out every detail. The entire proposal sounded risky, uncomfortable, and completely unnecessary. "You've spent your entire life building this reputation," Michael told him. "Why would you throw it away for an experiment?" Ethan's answer came immediately. Because this wasn't about reputation anymore. It was about truth. For a moment, neither man spoke. Then Ethan looked out the window toward the city lights and finally put into words what had been weighing on him for years. "I don't want a woman who loves my money," he said quietly. "I want a woman who sees me." The room fell silent. It was the most honest thing Michael had heard Ethan say in a very long time. Within weeks, preparations began. Old clothing was purchased from thrift stores. A completely different appearance was created. Details of Ethan's identity were hidden behind a carefully constructed story. Arrangements were made to ensure that every woman he met would believe they were meeting an ordinary man who had fallen on difficult times. None of them would have any reason to suspect they were sitting across from one of the wealthiest men in America. What Ethan didn't realize was that this experiment would reveal far more than he intended. He believed he was testing other people. He believed he was searching for honesty in a world filled with appearances. But before the 30 days were over, he would discover uncomfortable truths about himself as well. And among the 10 women he was about to meet was one person whose reaction would eventually force him to confront a mistake he never saw coming. The experiment was ready. The disguises were prepared. The blind dates were scheduled. And as Ethan stepped into his new identity for the very first time, he had no idea that the journey ahead would lead him directly to the woman who would change everything. The first date was scheduled for a Thursday afternoon in a quiet coffee shop on the outskirts of the city. Ethan arrived early. Dressed in worn clothing and carrying a weathered backpack, he looked nothing like the billionaire whose face occasionally appeared in business magazines. Even after weeks of preparation, sitting alone at that table felt strange. For decades, people had treated him differently the moment they learned his name. Now, for the first time in years, he was completely invisible. At exactly 2 o'clock, the first woman walked through the door. Her name was Lauren. She spotted Ethan almost immediately. For a brief moment, their eyes met. Then something changed. Ethan noticed it instantly. The smile she had entered with disappeared. The enthusiasm that had been present just seconds earlier faded from her expression. It wasn't anger. It wasn't disappointment. It was something closer to discomfort. She approached slowly, introduced herself, sat down, and from the very beginning, the conversation felt forced. Ethan tried to break the ice by asking about her interests. Lauren answered politely but briefly. He asked about her work. She responded with only a few words. Long silences began filling the space between questions. Several times she glanced toward the entrance as though she wished she were somewhere else. At first, Ethan assumed she was nervous. Blind dates could be awkward for anyone. But as the minutes passed, another pattern emerged. Lauren kept checking her phone. Once, twice, then again. Every few moments her eyes drifted downward toward the screen. Notifications appeared to hold more of her attention than the conversation sitting directly across from her. Ethan remained patient. He wasn't expecting immediate chemistry. The purpose of the experiment wasn't romance. It was observation. And what he observed during those 8 minutes told him more than he expected. Lauren never once asked about his story. She never asked how he had fallen on hard times. She never showed curiosity about the man sitting across from her. Instead, she seemed to spend the entire date searching for a polite exit. Then it finally came. Her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen and suddenly stood up. "I'm sorry," she said. "Something came up." The explanation sounded rushed. The smile looked forced. Within moments she was gone. Just like that. 8 minutes. That was all the time she had given him. Ethan sat alone for several seconds after she left. Not angry. Not surprised. Just thoughtful. Because the experience confirmed something he had already begun to suspect. People often make decisions long before a conversation ever starts. A person's appearance, their clothing, their perceived status. Sometimes those things speak louder than words. As Ethan watched Lauren leave through the front door, he wondered whether the next date would be different. Maybe this had simply been bad luck. Maybe the next woman would be more open-minded. Maybe someone would take the time to see beyond first impressions. That evening, Michael called to check on him. When Ethan described the encounter, Michael wasn't shocked. In fact, he seemed relieved. "One bad date doesn't prove anything," Michael said. "There are 9 more." Ethan agreed. There were still 9 opportunities remaining. 9 chances for someone to surprise him. 9 chances to discover whether genuine connection was still possible. What neither man realized was that the next date would be far worse. Because unlike Lauren, the second woman wouldn't simply leave early. What happened during date number 2 would leave Ethan questioning whether the experiment had been a terrible mistake from the very beginning. If the first date left Ethan Carter disappointed, the next 4 left him confronting realities that were far more uncomfortable. As the experiment continued, each meeting seemed to reveal a different side of human nature. Some encounters lasted only minutes. Others stretched longer but offered little hope. With every date, Ethan found himself learning less about romance and more about the assumptions people make when they believe they know someone's place in society. Date number 2 began badly and ended even worse. The woman arrived nearly 15 minutes late. When she finally sat down, her eyes moved immediately to Ethan's worn jacket and faded shoes. At first she appeared confused. Then she laughed. Not a nervous laugh, not an awkward laugh. The kind of laugh someone makes when they believe they have walked into a situation beneath them. She asked if the dating service had made a mistake. Ethan calmly assured her they had not. For several uncomfortable minutes, she continued making jokes about his appearance. By the time she left, Ethan had barely spoken. The entire interaction felt less like a conversation and more like a judgment. Date number 3 revealed something different. This woman remained polite, but her words carried an edge that became sharper as the conversation progressed. When Ethan explained that life had become difficult financially, she immediately began offering opinions about people she believed had failed in life. According to her, anyone struggling economically simply hadn't worked hard enough. She spoke confidently about success while knowing almost nothing about the man sitting across from her. The irony wasn't lost on Ethan. One of the country's most successful businessmen was being lectured about ambition by someone who assumed he had none. Before leaving, she told him he needed to get his life together. The words stayed with him long after she was gone. Date number 4 was perhaps the most unsettling. From the moment she arrived, Ethan sensed tension. She kept looking around the restaurant. Her answers became shorter. Her body language grew increasingly cautious. Eventually, she admitted that meeting a man who appeared homeless made her nervous. Ethan understood her concerns, but what happened next caught him off guard. Without realizing he could see her screen, she discreetly sent a text message to a friend describing him and sharing their location. A few minutes later, she ended the date and left quickly. Ethan couldn't blame her for being careful, yet it served as another reminder of how powerfully appearances shape perception. Then came another encounter that surprised him for an entirely different reason. Halfway through the conversation, Ethan noticed something unusual. The woman sitting across from him kept adjusting her phone. At first he thought nothing of it. Then he noticed the camera lens pointed directly toward him. She was secretly recording the interaction. Whether she intended to share it with friends, post it online, or simply keep it for herself, Ethan never learned. The date ended shortly afterward, but the experience lingered in his mind. For years, people had wanted access to Ethan Carter because of his wealth. Now, under a different identity, people were reacting to him in ways he never imagined. By the end of the fourth disappointing date, even Michael began questioning whether the experiment was worth continuing. The results seemed discouraging. Every encounter appeared to reinforce Ethan's fears. And for the first time since the project began, even Ethan wondered whether he had already found his answer. Maybe people really did judge too quickly. Maybe genuine connection had become harder than he wanted to admit. Maybe the walls he felt around him weren't entirely imagined. But before we continue, think about this for a moment. If you had met Ethan during those 30 days, with no knowledge of his wealth, no knowledge of his success, and no knowledge of the man he truly was, would you have given him a chance? It's an easy question to answer from a distance. Much harder when first impressions are involved. Fortunately for Ethan, the story wasn't over. Because after 4 disappointing encounters, the 5th blind date arrived. And unlike everyone before her, the woman who walked through that door didn't focus on Ethan's clothes. She didn't focus on his appearance. She didn't focus on what he lacked. What happened during that meeting would change the direction of the experiment completely. And for the first time since this journey began, Ethan found himself wondering whether the answers he had been searching for all along might finally be sitting across the table from him. By the time date number 5 arrived, Ethan Carter's expectations had changed dramatically. When the experiment began, he hoped to discover whether genuine connection was still possible. After 4 disappointing encounters, that hope had faded. He still showed up to each meeting committed to the process, but the optimism he carried during the first week was gone. Every negative interaction had reinforced the fears that had driven him to start the experiment in the first place. People seemed eager to judge, quick to dismiss, and unwilling to look beyond appearances. Ethan wasn't angry about it. If anything, he was becoming resigned to it. He had spent decades believing money complicated relationships. Now he was beginning to wonder whether human nature itself was the bigger obstacle. Then Sarah walked through the door. At first glance, there was nothing dramatic about her arrival, no grand entrance, no attempt to attract attention. She simply entered the small cafe, looked around the room, and smiled when she spotted Ethan sitting at the corner table. It was a simple smile, but after everything he had experienced over the previous weeks, it immediately stood out. There was no confusion in her expression, no disappointment, no visible discomfort. She approached calmly, introduced herself, and sat down as though meeting him was the most natural thing in the world. Sarah was 52 years old and worked as a school librarian. She had been divorced for several years and lived a quiet life outside the spotlight. Unlike many people Ethan knew, she didn't seem interested in impressing anyone. Her clothes were modest. Her manner was relaxed. She carried herself with a confidence that didn't rely on attention or approval. From the moment the conversation began, Ethan noticed something unusual. She listened. Actually listened. Not the way people often pretend to listen, while waiting for their turn to speak. Not the way business associates listened while calculating what they could gain from a conversation. Sarah listened with genuine interest. When Ethan spoke, she paid attention. When he answered a question, she asked thoughtful follow-up questions. She didn't rush. She didn't glance repeatedly at her phone. She didn't seem eager for the meeting to end. For the first time since the experiment started, Ethan felt as though he was speaking to someone who saw him as a person rather than a category. The conversation flowed naturally. They talked about books. They talked about childhood memories. They talked about mistakes they had made and lessons they had learned. At one point, Sarah shared a story about a struggling student she had helped years earlier. The pride in her voice wasn't connected to money, status, or recognition. It came from knowing she had made a difference in someone's life. Ethan found himself smiling more than he had during any of the previous dates combined. What surprised him most was what Sarah didn't ask. She didn't ask about his finances. She didn't ask what kind of car he drove. She didn't ask about investments, properties, or career achievements. The subjects that dominated so many conversations in Ethan's world never seemed to interest her. Instead, she focused on character, experiences, values, the things people rarely discussed in boardrooms or luxury penthouses. As the date continued, Ethan noticed himself becoming cautious in a different way. Until now, he had spent the experiment protecting himself from disappointment. But sitting across from Sarah created a new concern. What if she really was different? What if he finally found the kind of person he had been searching for all along? The possibility excited him. It also frightened him, because experience had taught him that first impressions could be misleading. After all, Vanessa had once seemed perfect too. People often reveal their true nature slowly. And Ethan knew better than most how dangerous assumptions could be. When the date finally ended, Sarah stood up, smiled, and thanked him for the conversation. It sounded sincere. There was no rush to escape, no awkward excuse, no visible regret about spending time together. As Ethan watched her leave, he found himself replaying every moment of the conversation. For the first time in weeks, he felt hopeful. But hope came with uncertainty, because one question refused to leave his mind. Was Sarah genuinely different from everyone else? Or was she simply better at hiding her intentions? The answer would determine everything that followed. And before long, Ethan would begin putting that question to the test. The days following Ethan Carter's first meeting with Sarah were different from anything he had experienced since the experiment began. Usually, after a date ended, he spent a few minutes reflecting before moving on. With Sarah, however, he found himself thinking about their conversation long after it was over. Her calm confidence, the way she listened, the absence of judgment, it all felt genuine. Yet Ethan had spent enough years navigating both business and personal relationships to know that appearances could be deceiving. One pleasant conversation wasn't enough to erase the lessons of the past. If Sarah truly was different, time would reveal it. And if she wasn't, Ethan intended to find out before allowing himself to become emotionally invested. Their second meeting took place a week later. This time, Ethan arrived with a plan. Nothing cruel. Nothing designed to embarrass her. Just a series of small situations intended to reveal character. Over the years, Ethan had learned that people often showed who they really were during ordinary moments. Grand speeches and impressive promises meant very little. Actions mattered more. The first test happened almost immediately. While paying for a cup of coffee, Ethan casually allowed several folded bills to slip from his pocket onto the floor. The money landed near Sarah's chair. It would have been easy for her to ignore it. It would have been even easier to pretend she never noticed. Instead, before Ethan could react, Sarah bent down, picked up every dollar and handed it back to him. There was no hesitation, no calculation, no expectation of praise. Just a simple act of honesty. Ethan thanked her and continued the conversation as though nothing had happened. A little later, he created another opportunity. As they prepared to leave the cafe and take a short walk, Ethan intentionally left his wallet on the table. The wallet contained cash, identification, and several items that appeared important. They had already reached the sidewalk when Sarah suddenly stopped. "You forgot something," she said. Without waiting for a response, she turned around and walked back inside to retrieve it. Again, there was no sign of temptation, no curiosity about what was inside, no attempt to take advantage of the situation. Just another quiet display of integrity. The more Ethan observed, the more impressed he became. But the biggest test wasn't about money at all. It was about hardship. During the second half of their meeting, Ethan shared a carefully crafted story about financial struggles. He described difficulties finding stable work. He spoke about periods of uncertainty and loneliness. Some parts of the story were fictional. Others reflected emotions he had genuinely experienced. As he talked, he watched Sarah closely. Many people become uncomfortable when conversations shift toward hardship. Others immediately offer advice without truly listening. Sarah did neither. Instead, she asked thoughtful questions. She showed empathy without pity. She treated Ethan with the same respect she had shown him during their first meeting. At no point did she make him feel lesser. At no point did she suggest that financial status determined a person's value. By the end of the evening, Ethan found himself facing a possibility he hadn't expected. Sarah had passed every test. Every single one. She had shown honesty, patience, compassion, and perhaps most importantly, consistency. The person he met during the first date appeared to be the same person he met during the second. For someone who had spent years questioning people's motives, that realization carried enormous weight. But just as Ethan began allowing himself to feel optimistic, something happened that stopped him in his tracks. A few days later, Michael Reynolds approached him with information he hadn't been expecting. It wasn't evidence of dishonesty. It wasn't proof that Sarah was interested in his money. In fact, it had nothing to do with wealth at all. Yet the discovery immediately caught Ethan's attention. Because despite her openness during their conversations, Sarah had been keeping a significant part of her life hidden. A part she had never mentioned. A part that raised questions neither Ethan nor Michael could answer. And for the first time since meeting her, Ethan found himself wondering whether there was a side of Sarah he hadn't seen yet. The question wasn't whether she was lying. The question was why she had chosen to keep this secret. And the answer would prove more complicated than Ethan ever imagined. After years of managing billion-dollar deals, Ethan Carter understood the importance of verification. Trust was valuable, but blind trust had cost him dearly in the past. As much as he wanted to believe Sarah was exactly who she appeared to be, experience told him to be careful. The discovery Michael Reynolds mentioned continued to linger in the back of his mind. Sarah had never given Ethan a reason to doubt her character, yet there were pieces of her life she had never discussed. That alone wasn't unusual. Everyone has private struggles. Still, Ethan couldn't ignore the questions. Reluctantly, he asked Michael to look deeper. Nothing invasive. Nothing illegal. Just enough to understand whether there was something important he needed to know. Michael wasn't enthusiastic about the assignment. Over the previous weeks, he had grown increasingly convinced that Sarah was different from the other women Ethan had met. Nevertheless, he agreed. For several days, Michael quietly gathered information. And as he did, he found himself expecting the same thing many people would have expected. A hidden agenda. A financial motive. A secret relationship. Something that would explain why Sarah seemed too good to be true. Instead, he discovered something entirely different. The first surprise came when he learned Sarah wasn't working just one job. She was working two. During the day, she managed her responsibilities as a school librarian, helping students, organizing programs, and spending countless hours encouraging young readers. In the evenings, several times a week, she worked additional hours performing administrative work for a local community organization. The extra income wasn't funding luxury vacations or expensive hobbies. It was helping someone else. As Michael continued digging, he uncovered a reality Sarah had never mentioned during either of her conversations with Ethan. For nearly a decade, she had been helping care for her older brother. Following a serious accident years earlier, her brother had been left with significant physical limitations that made independent living difficult. Sarah had quietly stepped into the role of caregiver. She helped manage appointments. She assisted with expenses. She adjusted large portions of her own life to ensure he received the support he needed. Yet she never spoke about it. She never used it to gain sympathy. She never presented herself as a hero. To most people around her, it was simply something she did because family mattered. The discoveries continued. Michael learned that Sarah regularly volunteered at a local shelter, not once a year during the holidays, not for public recognition, not for social media attention. She showed up consistently throughout the year. Sometimes she helped organize donations. Other times she prepared meals or assisted families navigating difficult circumstances. Many of the people she helped didn't even know her last name. The deeper Michael looked, the more one thing became clear. Sarah's life was remarkably ordinary. And that was precisely what made it extraordinary. She lived modestly. Her car was several years old. Her home was comfortable but far from luxurious. There were no signs of hidden wealth, no evidence of manipulation, no trail of suspicious behavior. The picture that emerged was that of a woman who spent much of her time helping others while asking for very little in return. When Michael finally presented his findings, Ethan sat quietly for several moments. The report contained none of the warning signs he had expected. Instead, it painted a portrait of someone whose actions matched her words. Someone who appeared genuine. Someone who seemed to possess the very qualities Ethan had been searching for. For the first time since the experiment began, even Michael found himself rooting for the outcome. And if he felt that way, Ethan felt it even more strongly. The walls he had spent years building were beginning to crack. Not because Sarah had demanded anything from him, but because she hadn't. She continued treating him exactly the same way she had on the first day. As a person, nothing more, nothing less. Yet while Ethan was slowly learning the truth about Sarah, another development was unfolding beyond his awareness, a development that threatened everything. Because despite all of Ethan's efforts to protect his identity, a small detail had slipped through the cracks. A detail that seemed insignificant at first, until Sarah noticed it. And once she did, the carefully constructed reality Ethan had spent weeks maintaining began to unravel. The experiment had always been built on one enormous lie. A lie Ethan justified because he believed it served a greater purpose. But very soon, Sarah would discover the truth. Not part of it, not hints of it, the entire truth. And when she did, the reaction Ethan feared most would finally become a reality. Because the woman who appeared to value honesty above everything else was about to learn that the man she trusted had been deceiving her from the very beginning. For weeks, Ethan Carter had managed to keep the two worlds separated. On one side was the man Sarah knew, a struggling individual trying to rebuild his life. A man who wore worn clothing, carried a weathered backpack, and spoke honestly about loneliness, disappointment, and second chances. On the other side was the truth. The private helicopters, the penthouse overlooking Manhattan, the billion-dollar logistics empire, the boardrooms, the executives, the life he had spent decades building. Until now, those two realities had never collided. Then one ordinary Tuesday changed everything. The discovery happened completely by accident. Sarah had finished a meeting across town and was walking toward her car when she noticed a familiar figure several yards ahead. At first, she wasn't entirely sure it was Ethan. The clothing was different. The posture was different. Even the way he carried himself seemed unfamiliar. Curious, she slowed her pace. The man she believed was struggling financially was dressed in an expensive tailored suit. Sarah stopped walking. For several seconds, she simply watched. The resemblance was undeniable. It was Ethan. Before she could process what she was seeing, he crossed the street and entered one of the most prestigious office towers in Manhattan. The kind of building reserved for major corporations and powerful executives. Sarah stood frozen. Confusion quickly replaced curiosity. None of it made sense. Over the previous weeks, Ethan had shared stories about financial hardships, uncertain employment, and a difficult chapter in his life. Yet the man she had just seen looked completely different from the person she thought she knew. Part of her wanted to dismiss it. Part of her hoped there was a reasonable explanation. But another part couldn't ignore the feeling growing inside her. Something was wrong. Without fully thinking it through, Sarah followed. Inside the lobby, she approached the reception desk and casually asked about the company occupying the upper floors. The answer left her speechless. Not only was Ethan connected to the building, he owned the company headquartered there. As Sarah continued asking questions, the pieces began falling into place. The photographs, the articles, the executive profiles, the interviews. Every screen seemed to display the same face. Ethan Carter, founder, chief executive officer, billionaire entrepreneur, one of the most successful business leaders in America. For several moments, Sarah simply stared. The realization felt impossible. Every conversation, every story, every detail she believed she knew. None of it had been real. Or at least that was how it felt. Back at his office, Ethan had no idea what had happened. He continued with meetings, presentations, and business decisions, unaware that the carefully constructed experiment was collapsing around him. Then his phone rang. The moment he saw Sarah's name on the screen, something felt different. There was no warmth in her voice, no relaxed conversation, no laughter, just a single request. "We need to talk." An hour later, they sat across from each other. The atmosphere was completely different from every meeting before it. Ethan immediately understood that she knew. The question was how much. As he looked into her eyes, he realized the answer was everything. Sarah had discovered the truth. Not part of it. All of it. The disguise. The experiment. The billionaire. The lies. For weeks, Ethan had imagined this moment. He had prepared explanations, justifications, arguments. Yet now that it was actually happening, none of those preparations seemed useful. Because the disappointment on Sarah's face was impossible to ignore. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Ethan began explaining. He talked about Vanessa. He talked about betrayal. He talked about trust. He talked about the experiment and the fears that had motivated it. The words came quickly. But as he spoke, Sarah's expression never changed. When he finally finished, silence filled the room. Then Sarah spoke. And what she said hit Ethan harder than anything he expected. "I don't care about your money." The words landed like a punch. Not because they were harsh. Because they were sincere. Sarah wasn't impressed. She wasn't excited. She wasn't asking questions about his wealth. She wasn't interested in his properties or his company. The very reaction most people would expect never came. Instead, she looked directly at him and continued, "I care that you lied." Ethan had spent weeks worrying that someone would want him because of his money. He had never seriously considered the possibility that someone would reject him because of the deception. Yet sitting there, he realized that was exactly what was happening. Sarah wasn't upset that he was rich. She was upset because she believed trust mattered. And from her perspective, every conversation they shared had been built on a foundation that wasn't real. For the first time since the experiment began, Ethan found himself on the opposite side of the test. He wasn't evaluating someone else's character anymore. His own character was being evaluated, and the results were far from certain. The painful irony became impossible to ignore. After weeks of searching for someone who wasn't interested in his wealth, he had finally found her. After countless disappointments, he had finally met someone who appeared genuine. Someone who treated him with kindness before knowing anything about his success. Someone who saw the person instead of the bank account. And now, because of the choices he had made, he might lose her. Not because of money. Not because of status. Not because she wanted something from him. But because she valued honesty enough to walk away when it was missing. As Sarah stood up to leave, Ethan felt a fear greater than anything he had experienced during the entire experiment. The one woman who never cared about his wealth was slipping away. And for the first time, he wasn't worried about failing the experiment. He was worried about losing the person who had finally given him the answer he had spent years searching for. After Sarah walked away, Ethan Carter remained seated for a long time. The conversation replayed in his mind over and over again. Not because she had discovered his wealth. Not because the experiment had been exposed. But because of the disappointment in her eyes. Over the previous month, Ethan had prepared himself for countless possible outcomes. He expected suspicion. He expected curiosity. He expected excitement if anyone ever learned the truth. What he never expected was genuine hurt. Sarah's reaction forced him to confront something uncomfortable. For weeks, he had justified the deception by telling himself it served a greater purpose. He convinced himself that hiding his identity was necessary if he wanted honest answers. But from Sarah's perspective, the situation looked entirely different. She hadn't agreed to participate in an experiment. She hadn't knowingly become part of a test. She thought she was building trust with another human being. Instead, she discovered that many of the details she believed about him had been carefully constructed. The realization weighed heavily on him. For the first time since the experiment began, Ethan stopped thinking about what other people had done. Instead, he started thinking about what he had done. The following morning, Michael Reynolds found him sitting alone in his office before sunrise. Stacks of reports sat untouched on the desk. Emails remained unanswered. The billionaire who usually moved through problems with confidence seemed unusually quiet. When Michael asked what he planned to do next, Ethan surprised him. "I'm going to apologize." Michael nodded. It sounded simple. But both men understood that Ethan rarely apologized. Throughout his career, he solved problems with action. If a business struggled, he invested resources. If an employee faced hardship, he provided assistance. If a relationship became strained, he often tried to fix it through practical solutions. Money had solved many challenges throughout his life. This wasn't one of them. For several days, Ethan considered different approaches. He could send flowers. He could arrange a luxury trip. He could purchase almost anything he wanted. But every idea felt wrong. The entire problem had started because Sarah believed he was hiding behind things that weren't real. Trying to repair the situation with gifts would only make matters worse. For perhaps the first time in years, Ethan realized there was nothing he could buy. There was only the truth. No tests, no games, no disguises, no carefully planned scenarios, no hidden motives, just honesty, the very thing Sarah believed had been missing. Eventually, Ethan wrote a letter. Not a corporate statement, not a polished speech prepared by public relations experts. A real letter, one that explained everything. He told Sarah about Vanessa and the broken engagement. He told her about the loneliness that followed. He admitted that fear had influenced many of his decisions. Most importantly, he admitted that the experiment had crossed a line. For all his intentions, he had forgotten that trust could not be demanded from others while being withheld from them. When he finished writing, he didn't ask anyone to edit it. He didn't revise it a dozen times. He simply sent it. Then he waited. Days passed. No response. For a man accustomed to controlling outcomes, the uncertainty felt unbearable. Business negotiations usually ended with an answer. Contracts were either accepted or rejected. Investments either succeeded or failed. This was different. Sarah owed him nothing. No explanation. No conversation. No second chance. The possibility that he might never hear from her again became increasingly real. And the more Ethan thought about it, the more he realized something important. The experiment had already given him the answer he was looking for. Sarah had proven she wasn't interested in his money. She had proven she wasn't impressed by his status. She had proven she valued honesty more than wealth. Ironically, the very qualities Ethan admired most were now the reason she might leave. 1 week later, his phone finally rang. For a brief moment, Ethan stared at the screen. Sarah. His heart raced in a way that no business deal ever could. He answered immediately. Neither of them spoke at first. The silence felt endless. Finally, Sarah broke it. Her voice was calm, measured. The anger that had filled their last conversation seemed quieter now, replaced by something more thoughtful. She told Ethan she had read the letter. More than once. She appreciated the honesty. She understood the pain that had led him to create the experiment. But understanding wasn't the same as forgiveness. Trust, she explained, takes time to build and only moments to damage. Ethan listened carefully. He didn't interrupt. He didn't defend himself. He didn't attempt to justify what he had done. For perhaps the first time in their relationship, he simply listened. Then Sarah asked for something unexpected. Not money. Not gifts. Not promises. Time. Time to decide whether she could move forward. Time to determine whether the man she came to know was real beneath all the deception. Time to answer a question only she could answer. And suddenly, the future Ethan wanted was no longer in his hands. Sarah stood at a crossroads. She could walk away forever. Or she could take a chance on the man behind the disguise. The answer would determine not only the future of their relationship, but the final outcome of the experiment that had changed both of their lives. And Ethan could do nothing except wait. 6 months later, Ethan Carter found himself standing in a place he never expected to reach when the experiment first began. Not because he had found all the answers. Not because every mistake had been erased. And certainly not because everything had become perfect. The difference was that, for the first time in many years, he was no longer trying to control every outcome. The months following Sarah's discovery had been challenging for both of them. Trust, once broken, doesn't return overnight. There were difficult conversations, uncomfortable questions, moments when old doubts resurfaced. Moments when Sarah wondered whether she could ever completely believe him again. Moments when Ethan questioned whether he deserved another chance at all. Yet something important had changed. The foundation of their relationship was no longer built on assumptions. It was built on truth. After Sarah agreed to continue seeing him, Ethan made a decision that surprised many of the people closest to him. He stopped testing people. Completely. The experiment was over. There would be no more hidden evaluations. No more carefully designed situations. No more attempts to predict how others might behave. The man who spent years trying to protect himself from disappointment finally understood that genuine connection always carries risk. Trusting another person means accepting uncertainty. There are no guarantees, no contracts, no perfect systems, only choice. Every day, people choose whether to trust one another. And every day, they risk getting hurt. For years, Ethan believed he could avoid that risk if he was careful enough. Sarah helped him realize that wasn't possible. As the months passed, their relationship grew stronger. Not because she suddenly became impressed by his success. Not because she enjoyed the lifestyle his wealth could provide. In fact, some of their happiest moments remained surprisingly ordinary. Simple dinners, long conversations, quiet afternoons spent together. The same kinds of moments they shared before she ever knew he was a billionaire. The difference was that now there were no secrets standing between them. Sarah eventually met the real Ethan Carter. Not the billionaire from magazine covers. Not the struggling man from the experiment. The real person beneath both identities. The man who carried scars from failed relationships. The man who feared being valued for the wrong reasons. The man who spent years searching for certainty in a world where certainty rarely exists. And Ethan learned something about Sarah as well. The qualities that first impressed him had been real all along. Her kindness wasn't an act. Her integrity wasn't a performance. Her compassion wasn't conditional. She remained exactly who she had been on the day they first met. The only difference was that now Ethan finally trusted what he was seeing. Looking back, he often reflected on the irony of the entire journey. The experiment began because he wanted to discover whether anyone could love him without knowing about his wealth. In the end, the greatest challenge wasn't finding someone genuine. It was becoming honest enough to deserve someone genuine. That realization changed him more than any business success ever had. Because throughout most of his life, Ethan believed money was his greatest obstacle. He thought wealth complicated relationships. He thought success created distance. He thought fortune was the reason genuine connection seemed so difficult to find. But after everything that happened, he finally understood the truth. Money wasn't his biggest problem. Trust was. Not trust in other people. Trust in himself. Trust in his ability to be vulnerable. Trust in his willingness to stop hiding behind fear. The answers he spent years searching for had never been locked inside bank accounts, business deals, or social experiments. They were waiting on the other side of honesty. And perhaps that was the lesson Ethan Carter needed all along. Because at the end of the day, relationships aren't built on wealth. They aren't built on appearances. They aren't built on status. They are built on truth. And truth requires courage. The courage to be seen for who you really are. The courage to trust, despite the possibility of disappointment. And the courage to believe that the right people will stay when the masks come off. Now we'd love to hear your thoughts. If you were Sarah, would you forgive Ethan after discovering the truth? Or would the deception be a deal breaker, no matter how good his intentions were? Let us know your answer in the comments below, because We genuinely love to hear your perspective. And if you enjoyed this story, subscribe for more unbelievable stories about wealth, trust, betrayal, and second chances. Because the next story might challenge everything you think you know even more than this one did.